Thanks, Rich. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kevin Kennedy from SALA, and today I'm introducing Jeff Cobb and Cecilia Steele, co-founders of Tagoras. Together, they have more than 35 years' experience working in the world of education and technology, and they are keen observers of the evolving learning landscape. Through a combination of independent research, educational events, and strategic advisory services, Jeff and Celisa help organizations in the business of lifelong learning maximize the reach, revenue, and impact of their offering.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Rich. Thanks to SALA for having us. We're glad to be here to talk about the new learning landscape and factors that are going to allow small associations to thrive in the new learning landscape. I'm Celisa Steele, co-founder and managing director at Tagoras. And in today's session, we really want to be of service to you. And to that end, we actually want to start by asking what questions you have. What questions about the new learning landscape did you bring to the session? What are your questions about providing learning that's highly valued by your members and even by learners more broadly than your membership base? We really encourage you to share your comments and questions starting now and continuing throughout this session. As Rich was pointing out, you have a couple of options for sharing. You can use the Q&A panel to send your questions straight to Jeff and me, or you can share comments and questions in the chat area. And if you select to send your notes to all panelists and attendees, everybody will be able to see what you're sending in.
Hi there, this is Jeff Cobb, the other co-founder and managing director at Tagoras. And as Celisa said, we do want you to take a few seconds to send in any questions you came to today's session with. If you have any, it's good to share them early on so we can make sure that we get to them. And I'll pause here for, or just wait here for a few seconds for that at least. And we'll say that, the length of the webinar, the amount of time we spend together today will be driven by how many questions there are. We certainly wanted to provide ample time to make sure that we have answered all questions and that you have the opportunity, because things are getting quite dynamic and confusing out there in the market for education. So, to fully understand the role of the education and learning that you provide, we feel it's really critical to understand how the overall market for adult lifelong learning has changed. That's kind of the backdrop. You need to understand the new learning landscape, because that's the landscape your organization and its offerings exist in. So this slide is courtesy of our colleague Heather McGowan, who is a big thinker about the future of work, and the future of work really is a huge driver of this learning landscape. And in this paradigm that's pictured here, people spend the first couple of decades of their life learning how to do something in school. So you go to school, you learn how to do it, and then they go out into the workplace, they get a job, and they work their way up the career ladder, and eventually they retire. And this is, this is the model, this is the paradigm that probably everybody is familiar with to at least a certain extent. But of course, there's a rub in all of this, and that's that this is the old paradigm, and it doesn't hold true anymore. The new paradigm looks like this. And in this new paradigm, learning becomes integral throughout our life. In fact, we're probably all already feeling this. We learn, we work, we go learn more, we apply it on the job, we go learn again, we put it to work on the job, and on, rinse and repeat. And retirement is no longer the norm. We remain engaged longer, in large part because our life expectancy has gone up quite a bit over the last century or so, meaning that there's really a longer span of time in which we need learning. We're working longer, we're living longer, learning is important throughout all of that. It's important to note that this new reality also has an undercurrent of insecurity in the job market in particular, this whole future of work here, because, jobs are outsourced, offshored. We're increasingly seeing jobs replaced by machines, whether that means robots or artificial intelligence or a combination of the two. And we also know that most people are going to shift jobs, partly because of these forces, multiple times during their careers, 12 times, in fact, on average. And roughly a third of our workforce, and this kind of blows my mind here, but nearly 54 million people now work as freelancers. And these are people who don't have a corporate training department to support them. And a majority of the rest of the workforce works in small businesses of some sort or small organizations, most of which are able to give limited, if any, support to the lifelong learning of their employees. So all of the activity we're seeing on this image is very often activity people have to manage themselves, and they're eager for sources of support in doing it.
So we have a K through 12 system that serves most learners in the first part of their lives. And then some go on to higher education. But by age 22 or so, many people are done with formal education. And yet the need to learn doesn't stop, as Jeff was just explaining. And so we have another 55 years, give or take. The average life expectancy for Americans is about 79 years now. And so most of us have 55 years or more in which we continue to learn and in which we need to continue to learn. And the learning that occurs in those other 55 plus years is only going to grow in importance as the shelf life of college degrees dwindles and retooling becomes imperative as technology and other changes fundamentally alter how we work and live and learn. A variety of learning businesses provide options for learning in those other 55 plus years. So trade and professional associations fill the gap, along with training companies, continuing education programs at colleges and universities, solo edupreneurs, and more. And so we're seeing a third sector of education take shape and serve learners in the other 55 plus years, a third sector of education made up of learning businesses, of individuals like you and organizations like yours. But as you're probably all too well aware, your association isn't the only option for your learners.
That's right. In this new landscape, the third sector of education, competition has really picked up, and I'd love to see it. If you're an attendee here, if you're seeing more competition in your market for lifelong learning, continuing education, professional development, just type a yes into the chat. Let us know if you're seeing that. What I've got up on the screen here is a visualization of the 5 forces of competitive strategy, which was developed many years ago by Harvard professor Michael Porter, who's one of the best known strategy gurus out there. The model is more than 30 years old at this point, but it's still a model that works very, very well for providing insight into what's happening in the market for lifelong learning. And so, what's going on is everybody who's in this market has rivalry among existing competitors. Most organizations, you may have more or less competition, but you probably got, some other organization or some private company, somebody you've traditionally competed with at least a little bit, to get people to your meetings or to participate in your online learning, whatever it is. So you've got that rivalry among existing competitors, and that's starting to build up even more than used to be the case. And part of the reason that's building up is because of some of the other forces here. So in addition to that rivalry, there's now the threat of new entrants. And this is really a significant threat in the context of the current lifelong learning market. We're seeing more commercial firms come into the market as they realize the importance of everything that we've just been talking about. They realize that this is a vibrant market. We're also starting to see startups and venture capital firms get involved with those startups. We're seeing a lot of small and solo edupreneurs entering the market. So, more and more options coming into the marketplace. That threat of new entrants is growing. And then along with that, we'll just move clockwise around here, the bargaining power of buyers is changing. And of course, your buyers in this case are your learners. And learners now have all those new options that the rivalry and the new entrants are providing to them. They also have new expectations. And so they're able to be pickier because they have more choices and the bar is higher for those choices. So that bargaining power of buyers is increased. And then continuing to move around, there's the threat of substitute products or services. And this is a place where particularly the free factor pays in. And we hear about this a lot from organizations, that they're often competing against free now. And the biggest free, of course, is Google, the search engine that's been, intertwined into our lives and gives you an immediate path to get to just-in-time resources that you may need. And of course, a big source of those just-in-time resources is YouTube, also owned by Google, also a huge search engine, and being able to find video content on just about anything you would want. And then the rise of massive open online courses, or MOOCs, the big providers like Coursera and edX are putting great content out there, often completely free. Maybe you pay a little bit if you're going to get a certificate or some credit from it, but this whole crop of new products and services that are out there. And then finally, the last point, the bargaining power of suppliers. And in the case of continuing education, professional development, your suppliers, the main ones, are your subject matter experts. And those subject matter experts now have all sorts of new options. Some of those startups that are coming into the market are providing them with great platforms for easily getting their content out to the world in the form of online courses and other offerings. And those subject matter experts have new expectations. They used to really rely on associations in particular as an intermediary, a way to get to the association's audience. It's now increasingly possible for them to get directly to that audience. And that changes the relationship, and it's something that organizations have to take into account. And in general, if you're going to operate, compete, thrive in this new third sector market, you have to take these forces into account as you consider what role your organization can play and should be playing in this new learning landscape.
And the big takeaway from all of this is that the new learning landscape requires a shift in mindset, a shift from a focus on education to a focus on learning. In this new paradigm, this new reality of rapid change, longer lives, more job switches, we need less education and more learning. We need less of a set product, an education that we complete by the time we're 22, and we need more of an ongoing process, learning as a constant retooling and refinement of what we know and do. And this shift in mindset is important for all organizations, but it's particularly important for smaller organizations that often aren't in a position to build out a big catalog of educational offerings. What's working in favor of smaller organizations is people aren't necessarily looking for more courses, more classes, more conferences. Help them see you as an ongoing resource, a resource they can turn to monthly, weekly, even daily.
So that mindset shift is just incredibly important. It's really foundational to everything we'll talk about after this. We think it's incredibly important to how you think about the value that you can actually provide in this new learning landscape. Next, we're going to talk about some ways that you can remain or become that ongoing resource that Salisa's talking about. But first, we want to pause again to invite your questions and comments. We're big believers in trying to make sure we're addressing those along the way as they come up. So if you have questions, please share those. What comments do you have at this point? Do the broad societal changes that we've outlined so far jibe with what you're experiencing personally and with what your organization is facing? Take just a minute and, what are your questions? What are your comments? We'd love to hear those as we go along. And seeing none right now, we are going to continue along in the lifelong learning landscape. And we want to focus on 4 paths that we believe will help you remain or become, depending on what your situation is, a high-value source of learning for your members. And again, we're stressing learning over education, though education will remain a factor, and we'll talk about that as well. And we're going to offer...
Can I stop you real quick? We do have some questions that are coming in on chat.
Sure.
I don't know if you guys can see that or not.
I do. I see that, yeah.
Okay.
I see that Mona has asked how the competition we're seeing is in CE and CME credits. Great point. A lot of times the markets where those are factors, where continuing education credit is a factor, whether it's just a sort of more generic CE or particularly in something like CME, or if you're in the accounting market, CPE, or if you're in the legal market, CLE, and there are requirements for those types of continuing education credits, you're going to see a lot more competitive pressure in those markets. You're also going to see a lot of downward price pressure as more and more suppliers come into that market, and you get low costs and you get free. And that's one reason we think it's incredibly important to think not just about education, but about your value as a source of learning and the things we're going to talk about here in a minute. And if you are competing in those markets, to try to make your engagement with your learners less about the credit and more about the learning, more about the specific value of the types of content, the types of interactions that you're able to involve them in, because that's the only thing that's going to help to differentiate you and help you to maintain a higher price point. And I'm not going to tell you that that's easy to do, but if you step back and really think strategically about where some of your sources of value are, and some of them will flow from what we're about to talk about here, you can get offerings out there that are less about you're trying to sell CE credits, because there's really no reason why one CE credit is more valuable than another CE credit. It's just it's a number, basically. So if you're selling that, you're selling a commodity. You have to back up and say, how do we make this not a commodity and make it a distinctive or even unique source of value that's going to help us to maintain our audience? And then Bradley has asked, how can you engage audiences through text materials? Is the age of the big textbook dead? Interesting question. Every audience is different. For some audiences, I think the big text is still attractive. For a lot of scientific audiences, in particular, that can be true. I will say in general, we're certainly seeing a trend towards, and we'll talk about this some, towards smaller doses, smaller amounts of any type of learning, and that includes text. So how can you deliver the amount of text that they need at any given period of time? And that may still be the big textbook, but it's going to be digital, and it's going to have the search options and some of the ways to help them navigate those resources that they haven't necessarily had before. And we've actually worked with organizations who have taken entire certification manuals and basically turned them into an online education offering by getting them into a highly searchable and more interactive type format than they've been in the past. In any case, if you've got a big textbook to work with, and I'm going to assume, Bradley, maybe you've got this since you're asking about it, you've got a huge reservoir of content that you can start using in multiple ways. And we definitely do recommend multiple ways to leverage any content that you've got. So hopefully those insights are helpful. Please keep the questions coming, keep the comments coming. If we say anything you particularly agree with or that you particularly disagree with, we'd love to hear about that. At this point, though, I'm going to continue down that path. We said we're going to take you down 4 paths here and help you become that high value source of learning. And I'd encourage you to try to connect these as we're talking about them to those questions and how you do create more value, how you do potentially mine some of the content you have. And we're going to offer some tools and resources that can help you in doing that.
Great. So the first of the 4 paths we call the minimum effective dose. Many of us today feel time constrained. I know I do, and there just don't seem to be enough hours in the day to get what we need to get done, much less time to learn. And so what you can do at your association is take that reality into account. The minimum effective dose is small, it's short, but I want to emphasize that shortness is not only about length in terms of minutes, it's about being concise, about cutting away the extraneous without sacrificing the essential. This kind of learning is focused. It's geared toward addressing a very specific issue or opportunity. Maybe you can't cover all parts of a process in a short learning experience, but you can introduce the process or cover the first step, for example. This might be an approach to that big textbook. Again, maybe you're not going to give them the whole big textbook, but maybe you're going to give them, a key concept from part of it in a learning experience. The learning is accessible, so to the greatest extent possible, you want to minimize barriers to participation in the learning experience. So things like removing the need to travel, or making something available on demand versus having it only accessible on a specific day and at a specific time. And this kind of learning is immediately usable. It's something practical that learners can put to use right away, and that's going to have real impact. So short, focused, accessible, immediately usable content is incredibly valuable because it's that minimum effective dose. It's the right amount to achieve the desired outcome. No more, no less.
And there are good ways to create this kind of minimum effective dose learning at a relatively low cost. And this ties back at least a little bit to Bradley's question about engaging audiences through text. We think that plain email is an obvious choice here, and we think it's where most organizations should start, even if it doesn't seem cutting edge. If you're not really engaged yet and thinking about yourself more as a learning source as opposed to an education source, text and email in particular can be a great place. So, we all know that email is a medium that most members can easily relate to. We're already sending emails to them, and it's capable of delivering a lot of value. So how do you make it more valuable? How do you, make it part of learning? One of our favorite examples of the sort of minimum effective dose approach to email is an email that I get from the Association Executives of North Carolina, where I'm a member, and Rich Fanoff became the CEO there a couple of years ago. And he started, this is one of the things he started doing almost immediately, what he calls his 60-second updates that he'll send out, usually about weekly. The idea there is just to make it as brief as possible, short, as Celisa was saying, and very focused on what the members need to know at that point in time. And I suspect, I haven't talked to Rich about this, so I suspect he's not even thinking about it as a learning tool per se, because we don't, we tend to think classrooms and courses in education when we really should be thinking about learning. But this is a learning tool. It's helping members connect with information and resources that are important to the community and that can enhance their professional lives. And the more you think about it as a learning tool, the more you can, factor that into those short updates and think about, okay, we're sending out this 60-second update. What are some very powerful bits of learning that we could put in there? And we'll talk in a minute about how you can find those to be able to put into something like this. Now, beyond that, email is a great starting point, but beyond that, we really encourage you to consider video as a medium for quick sharing of knowledge if you're not already doing that. And they're, great tools and resources for doing this now, doing it cheaply. You don't have to have, the professional quality studio. You just want to capture some quick information and get it out there. So you can use a screen recorder like ScreenFlow or Camtasia, which we have links to up here. And those are going to allow you to record what's on your screen, record you talking, put together really just a nice, quick, dynamic little video to get out to your audience. Alternatively, or in addition to that, you can use Skype or Zoom, which chances are, a lot of you are already using. We're using Zoom here, obviously. But, aside from webinars and conference call type things, you can use those to create short interviews or explainer videos of things. And, there are many tools for easily capturing video and sharing it out to your members, whether that's through an email, on your website, or on a social media channel like, Facebook or LinkedIn, or a combination of all of the above. So, really taking advantage of those tools you have to create those minimum effective doses and start thinking actively about how you use those to cultivate and facilitate learning among your audience. So that's the first path, and it looks like we have one question coming up here, which I was just about to ask. What questions do we have about the minimum effective dose? And Bradley's asked, on the discussion of email and fast video, how do you think microlearning is going to change the learning landscape? Is it better to send out short intro bursts to engage customers than provide longer experiences? Or is it better to consistently engage learners with a micro experience to maintain consistency? And my answer to that question is yes, to both parts of it. As with anything, you need to think about what your objectives are, both your learning objectives and your strategic and business objectives. It's certainly a intro burst to engage customers, very attractive. That's something that we do in various ways. Great way to immediately get a sense of identity out to those folks, so they kind of understand more about you. They feel a little more engaged, a little more connected to you, and lead them to the resources that you offer. Video can be a fantastic tool for doing that. But, you know, as you also reference, engaging learners with micro experiences to maintain consistency, and I would say not even just to maintain consistency. Consistency is a part of it, but those sort of micro experiences can really, really help to reinforce learning over time. They're a great thing, for example, to follow, you know, some of your major conference sessions with, to send out some content after that, which might be video. It can even be email. There's some great email strategies for following up to conference content and other types of more traditional learning activities. So, you know, the starting question here was, you know, how do you think microlearning is going to change the learning landscape? We think it already has, and it will continue to. I mean, it's very much a buzzword right now, and there's going to be a lot of bad things that happen with it, because just sending out short content doesn't immediately amount to learning. To go back to what I was saying, you have to be strategic about it. You have to figure out what your learning goals are, what your business goals are. But the fact that we can do that now, and the fact that people are engaging with that type of content, I mean, that's part of the basis for why we're saying there needs to be this shift from education, as we have traditionally thought of it, to learning. And micro-learning really fits well with that shift. So, you know, definitely something to embrace. If there are other questions about the minimum effective dose, or comments about it, if anybody's doing anything along these lines, would love to hear that in the chat. But we do also want to offer a question for you to consider after this session. And this is sort of, you know, presenting you with a little bit of follow-on content. We're going to go ahead and present it here. This is something we could email to you a couple of days from now, though, or even send a short video to ask you about this and engage you around it. But if you want to try this path, we want you to think about the high-value content that you already have. You know, maybe your frequently asked questions are a good place to go for this, whether you already have formal FAQs or whether you need to you know, create some FAQs. What are those questions that you're frequently getting from members and prospective members? And you know, of that high-value content you have, could some of it be packaged in a format that's short, focused, accessible, and immediately usable? And that might be for, you know, customer engagement, new member engagement, as Bradley was just asking about, or it might be that, you know, continuous over time, you know, really helping your members, your customers to see your value, because they're continually getting this short high value content from you. So let's move on to the second path that we want to highlight, and this is what we call curating the chaos. So, you know, this path is built on the understanding that learning effectively often comes down to having access to the right information, the best information. And a great way for an organization to provide value is to help its members sift through the overwhelming amount of information that's out there. There are just so many choices, and, you know, people don't need an entire library worth of resources. They need help finding the most relevant resource or resources. To the extent that you can find and point them to the most relevant resources, you become extremely valuable, because you're saving them time and energy and allowing them to focus what time and energy they have on actually learning from and making use of what you provide. Now, of course, just as we were saying, you know, if you're going to send out emails and fast video, you need to have a plan, basically. It's critical to realize with this that you have to have a strategy for this type of curation, a way to get at what's going to be most valuable, or you'll just end up contributing to the chaos, which you definitely don't want to do. That's kind of anti-value, and that's not where we want to go. So to curate effectively means, first of all, to understand what types or categories of information are likely to be most useful to your members and how they are likely to put the information to work. And this comes, of course, from, first of all, asking, you know, through things like your member surveys, but also by simply paying careful attention to the questions that members ask, by what attracts the most attendance at your various events, by what members tend to share on social media, All of these are great sources. And when you have a strong sense of these things, you start to get a sense of what to emphasize and how to bring together information in the most compelling way. And really, that gets at the root of why the term curation, which is kind of a buzzword, but it's a buzzword that's endured for a long time. But, the reason that we use curation for these activities is because you really become like a seasoned museum curator who knows how to pull together a variety of different artifacts and objects and present them in a way that makes them coherent and meaningful to museum visitors. You're doing the same thing for people in the field or industry you serve with information.
And so we actually use a curation approach to create our monthly Leading Learning newsletter. We have 5 categories that we address in each newsletter. Strategy, marketing, trends are among them. And we offer one item in each category each month. And these are items that we find by curating other content from the Harvard Business Review, Seth Godin, and a range of other sources and sites that we keep up with. Occasionally, we link to our own blog articles or research in the newsletter, and that's something to keep in mind about curation. You can curate your own content to great effect. In terms of tools and resources, we use Feedly a lot for keeping tabs on blog content. And we have a video where Jeff walks through how he uses Feedly. And that can be a great way for you to be able to quickly appreciate what Feedly might do for you and your curation efforts. Pocket is a little app that's kind of like your browser's bookmark feature, but with some additional functionality. So Pocket installs a button on your browser, and then when you come across an interesting article, video, or image, you hit the Pocket button. It goes into your little pocket for later. And there are lots of other tools. So if you're interested in the possibilities, you can do a search on curation tools, and you will turn up lots of other options. And then lastly, we just wanted to mention that if you're interested in seeing what curated content might look like for your members, you can sign up for the Leading Learning newsletter, and hopefully you'll benefit not only from seeing the newsletter as an example of curation, but from the content too. So that is the second pass, the curating the chaos. And before we move on, again, we want to pause, find out what questions or comments you have about curating. And if you're doing curation for your members, please share that. We would love to hear. And we also do have a few questions for you to take back to discuss after the session with your team, or just to reflect on your own. So think about what topics you might focus on. As we mentioned, we focus our curation efforts for our newsletter on 5 categories or topics. So, think about what those topics might be that would make sense for your membership, for your learners. What sources might you leverage for curated content? So who are the experts? What are the sites, blogs, etc., that have the information, the tools, the news that your members would find valuable? And then think about how you might share the content that you curate. An email newsletter, like the Leading Learning newsletter, might make sense for you, or you might just want to be doing posts on social media channels, or you might think of some other way to share that curated content. Oh, great. So Mona's sharing that they have a portal that organizes their content and external content by category or topic, approximately 180 entries in this startup phase. Great. So it sounds like that's an initiative that's relatively new, but already getting some traction, 180 entries. And that's wonderful to start to have that. Thanks for sharing, Mona. If other people have examples of what they're doing around curation, we'd love to hear, or again, we certainly welcome your questions.
That's a great, really focused, formal example that Mona is sharing, which I think is something that organizations should strive for. And of course, you can be very informal with it, as you suggested, Celisa, sharing on social media channels. We do share our excess content from our newsletter on Facebook and through Twitter, kind of in a less formal way. So if people are following us on those channels, we're not just tweeting about what we had for dinner. We're finding curated, highly relevant content and putting that out on social media channels, so it's somewhat less formal. So there's a range of ways to engage here with curation. And of course, you can always tie these back to your more formal educational activities that relate to any of the resources or information that you're providing through curation. So to move on to our next path, as we've been talking about, the amount of choice and content out there is overwhelming. I'm sure everybody feels that. And another way to help your members and learners deal with the overwhelm is by what we call framing a vision. And it can just be amazingly powerful to provide a frame. Frames tell people what to focus on. By their very existence, they cut out some of the noise by saying, hey, pay attention to what's inside this frame. This is what you need to focus on. The rest isn't essential. So as an example of that, one of our favorites is another North Carolina organization. I referenced the Association Executives of North Carolina earlier. This one is a group called CAI that's in the kind of human resources field. And they've done a great job creating what I would characterize as a career path, basically, or a learning path. They've created a visual that shows anybody in their membership or their extended audience very clearly how they would walk through moving from being an individual contributor up to being, a very experienced manager or director. And in this case, this is all engaging with content that they have developed as part of their Management Advantage program. But a lot of organizations have, different programs like this and never really lay out the vision in a way that makes it immediately clear to somebody who comes to their website that, hey, they can walk this progression here, access this particular content set of experiences, and this is where it's going to take them. It really very clearly frames the vision, cuts through that overwhelm for them.
And as another example of framing a vision, we'll offer up the Learning Business Maturity Model. This is a model that Jeff and I created to gauge the maturity of a learning business according to characteristics and performance in 5 domains that we've found to be critical to the success of the learning businesses that we've been involved with over our years of work and experience. Those domains, by the way, correspond to the categories that we use for the Leading Learning newsletter that we curate. So leadership, strategy, capacity, portfolio, and marketing. And the aim with the maturity model is to provide a framework to help surface and assess problem areas, and then to provide a clear way to move from problem to opportunity and hopefully to innovation. So we developed the model to be both descriptive and prescriptive to help organizations understand where they are, and also to prompt action and give that action that they're going to take some direction and focus. And so the maturity model frames a vision of what it means to be a successful learning business. It frames the essential issues involved in being a mature learning business. It tells organizations what to focus in on, what's important. Now, framing a vision does not necessarily require tools and resources. Mostly it's about doing the thinking to figure out the right frame to determine what to focus on. But if part of how you want to convey your frame is through images, as CAI did with its Management Advantage that Jeff was talking about, and as we did with our maturity model, then you might want to check out Canva, which you see a screenshot of here. Canva makes it really easy to put together infographics. And infographics can be particularly powerful as a way to communicate your frame, because visuals are often easier to consume, easier to understand quickly than just text alone. And plus, images are shareable, so they can be a powerful way for you and your members to share your framing of a vision, to share it on social media and other ways. There are also a variety of sites like Fiverr and 99 Designs where you can get people to do this kind of graphical work at a reasonable cost if you don't want to take a do-it-yourself Canva kind of approach. And then if you want to look more closely at an example of framing a vision, the Learning Business Maturity Model is available on our website, tagoras.com/maturity. And along with the visual, you'll find an assessment that you can use to determine your organization's stage of maturity.
So before we move to the last path, we'll ask again, what are your questions or comments about framing a vision or anything else we've covered. You're probably getting the idea now, the point that we're very fond of questions. We feel like they are the root of learning, and even if you're not asking anything, just the fact that we're asking you what your questions are is no doubt getting some wheels spinning and making this a more effective learning experience. We do also want to offer a couple of questions for you to consider after this session on your own or with your team. We're also very big on reflection. So think about the content, the ideas and skills your learners need, the content that's essential and also complex and therefore maybe a little bit troublesome for them to figure out the vision for. What is that content? And then, answering that question will give you ideas for content you might seek to frame to provide guidance around what to focus on. And then the second question here, which is, how might you frame it? How do you frame that to provide that focus? And, maybe something like what CAI did around outlining competencies, but specific to your organization, that might be appropriate. Spelling out the skills and knowledge folks need to advance and tying that to your curriculum, the educational offerings that you provide, or maybe something like a maturity model where it's less specifically about a curriculum, though we do in fact tie this to a curriculum at some of our events, but it's more about an overarching vision for the field or industry or profession you serve, or possibly another approach. Those are just two kind of common approaches to really framing that learning journey for your members so that they have a sense of direction for how they can proceed. Let's move on now to the fourth and final path, and that is community as competitive advantage. And, we talked about how competitive this landscape is, but, community is what associations have the opportunity to excel at by nature. And if you leverage community as competitive advantage and actively manage for sharing of learning, you're going to create significant value. So start thinking and managing community as a learning context. And we see two key ways to do this. One is to focus more on leveraging the power of community in your traditional events, which you probably already have.
At the place-based conferences that we've hosted, we've used formats called dynamic panels, curated connections, and collaborative coaching because community just doesn't happen, or at least it doesn't usually just happen all on its own. So you need to help create the environment where community can come into being and flourish, and so that you can then harness that community for learning. To give you a better idea of what we're talking about, I'm going to explain one of these approaches that we've used. I'm going to talk about collaborative coaching. So in that situation, you have a learner volunteer to be the coachee, to be in the hot seat. At a place-based event, this is an actual stool or chair where other learners can see and hear the volunteer. That said, you could do collaborative coaching in a virtual format. We actually have done that as well. So you could have the coachee visible via webcam or heard via a mic or phone. That volunteer briefly shares a problem or an opportunity that she wants help with. And then other learners offer her in really rapid fire fashion ideas for how to address that problem or seize that opportunity. The person in the hot seat just listens, just takes it all in, all the suggestions coming in. And then at the end, the facilitator, who's been managing that flow of suggestions, offers his 2 cents. And then at the very end, that person in the hot seat has the opportunity to respond if she chooses. But it should be brief, and sometimes all that the coachee, all that the person in the hot seat wants to do is say thank you. Now, the learning potential for the recipient of the collaborative coaching, that person in the hot seat, is probably obvious. She gets to raise an issue that matters to her, and she gets to receive ideas and advice for how to deal with that issue. The learning potential for those providing the collaborative coaching may not be as apparent, but it's there. By its nature, collaborative coaching is participatory and active, so anyone can contribute a piece of advice or make a suggestion. And conferences are usually organized for a particular group of people or organized around a particular issue, and that means that the odds are pretty good that an issue raised by the person in the hot seat is going to be relevant for other learners there too. And even if the specific issue isn't relevant to one or more of the other learners or attendees there, the process is relevant, because everyone gets to see and hear how others think through an issue, and that can yield insights that can be applicable to other challenges, to other opportunities. And there's always that little altruistic jolt of helping someone else out. So collaborative coaching is a form of fostering community and doing so for the sake of learning. And it's a competitive advantage because, you know, while another organization may be able to get the same speaker that you got for your conference at their conference, they're not going to have the same attendees in the room. And so something like collaborative coaching shows how community can be organic and unique, and so can offer that competitive advantage.
And then, in addition to what can be done at face-to-face events, our research, which we do a lot of, shows online community as a significant area of growth. In the data we collected for our 2016 Association Learning Plus Technology report, about 22% of respondents said they currently, that were using technology for learning. About 22% of those said they had a learning community platform, and then about another 20% reported plans for using a platform in the coming 12 months. Those plans actually played out in the current survey, which we did not too long ago. About 37% said they used a private online community platform, and around 15% plan to use one in the year ahead. So it's getting close to a majority of organizations doing that. And our view is that online community platforms are on a path similar to webinars. I mean, we've seen the use of webinars grow dramatically over the past decade and a half, to the extent that, as you can see by the numbers here, there are very few organizations that don't offer webinars at this point, and that includes very small organizations. So having an online community in place is just very powerful because it maximizes members' access to each other and to you. And we know from a lot of research that the vast majority of learning is social. It's not a teacher standing in front of a classroom, but rather people interacting with each other. And this goes back to, the less education, more learning theme that's running through this. Now, Selah, we'll point out, offers a great example of this. I mean, this is an organization that basically grew out of a need for a community, and then the online community is an important and growing part of it. Now, keep in mind, though, that you don't necessarily have to implement a private platform. Platforms like Facebook and LinkedIn are still options, and we've seen those used really well, particularly Facebook in recent history. But the main thing is to treat whatever platform you use as a learning environment and to help facilitate interactions that will help learners learn and grow. So come to it with that mindset. And then keep in mind, as Celisa was saying, community doesn't just happen. Communities don't just happen. They require resources. And that can mean, for example, leveraging some of the content that you curate as opportunities for discussion in the community. A community is a great place to share curated content. And also, in our experience, communities are typically most successful when they're combined with community gathering opportunities, which might be a face-to-face event, or it might be, for example, this webinar. And these kinds of community gathering opportunities help to provide what we call social learning objects that can help spark conversation in the community.
As for resources for using a community as competitive advantage, we'll point you to a series that we wrote on not only how to, but why to use formats like collaborative coaching, dynamic panels, and curated connections. The link that we have here on this slide takes you to the last article in the series, but that article contains links back to the other two. We also have a resource on defining and designing social learning, and social learning is, of course, grounded in community. And then we have an interview with Richard Millington. He's the author of Buzzing Communities: How to Build Bigger, Better, and More Active Online Communities. And if you have, or if you are considering an online community, we encourage you to check out his work. And this podcast interview will give you a great overview of his work.
So now this will be our final pause for Q&A, and then we're going to wrap up briefly with a few more resources to help you figure out how to thrive in the new learning landscape. So at this point, what questions or comments do you have about community as competitive advantage, or anything else that we've touched on today. We welcome those questions, welcome those comments. And while you're thinking of them, here are some discussion questions around community for you to delve into after we wrap up. So again, reflection, being able to take this back and doing something with it in your organization. So, first off, assess how you do or don't use community in the learning you provide. What role does community play in the learning you provide? And be clear on what you're doing currently, where it's working and where it's not. And then you can think about where and how you might intentionally leverage community for learning. And we do truly encourage you to take these questions. Again, we'll be sending out the slides, so you'll have the questions, and take it seriously to put aside a few moments on your calendar later this week, either alone or with your team, and think through some of these questions to help you get as much as possible out of the webinar experience today.
So, in terms of what we want to leave you with, we just want you to know that we really do see one of our major roles at Tagoras as being in the business of helping other learning businesses. We really want to help you, folks who work in that third sector of education that we talked about at the beginning of the session. That's part of our mission, and as we hope you've gathered from this discussion, thriving in the new learning landscape really requires continuously retooling and continuously learning. And so we want to help by providing resources that can help you continue to learn. We mentioned the Leading Learning newsletter when we talked about curation. It's a short monthly e-newsletter that covers the topics we see as essential to learning businesses. Jeff and I also host a weekly podcast, the Leading Learning Podcast. We interview practitioners and thought leaders about the learning landscape, and we offer our own perspective on issues and ideas, always with a focus on being as practical and as actionable as possible. And if you happen to be looking for a learning platform, we encourage you to check out reviewmylms.com. There you can share and access peer reviews of learning management systems, and the focus there is specifically on systems that are a good fit for learning businesses. And lastly, I'll just mention that we've set up a page for SELA folks at tagoras.com/SELA, and there you can easily access these 3 resources that I just highlighted, but you can also learn more about what else we have to offer.
So thanks for joining us today. Here's our contact info, and we welcome hearing from any of you about questions that you might have or sharing with us what you're doing. We always like to find out what organizations are doing to promote learning in their community. So feel free to reach out. Again, that link to the tagoras.com SELA page is there. And Rich, I'm going to hand it back over to you to take us out.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to thank both of you, Jeff and Salisa, for a great presentation today. The webinar was recorded, and we will distribute the link out to recording shortly, later today or this evening. And also for a list of any of all future webinars, please visit our website at smallassociations.org. Thanks again to all of you for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.